It was a Saturday evening, and the sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a dusky twilight that blurred the line between day and night. Deciding whether to switch on the headlights might have been tricky for others, but Mark Evans didn't need to worry. He was already pulling into his garage on a quiet street in Sharpsburg. Moments later, a lean, dark-haired man stepped out of the side door, expertly juggling a duffel bag, a briefcase, and a laptop. Years of practice made carrying the items seem effortless. Without announcing himself to his wife, Lisa, he knew she wasn't home. He entered the house and set his things down. The briefcase and laptop landed on the couch, while the garment bag found its place at the base of the stairs. He shrugged off his coat and hung it neatly in the closet by the front door. Then, loosening his tie and undoing the top buttons of his shirt, he began to unwind. Mark had just come back from a regional meeting of managers at ABC Industries, though technically, he wasn't a manager himself. As the top systems analyst, his supervisor, a skilled organizer but hopeless when it came to IT, had insisted on his presence at the Pittsburgh meeting. To Lisa, he had mentioned he'd return Monday, using the excuse of weekend seminars following the meeting. It wasn't entirely honest, but he had his reasons and didn't want to come home earlier than planned. He found himself regretting not packing more casual clothes for the trip, knowing Lisa would have asked uncomfortable questions. Now back home, he grabbed a quick shower, changed into jeans and a polo shirt, and helped himself to some leftovers from the fridge, pairing the meal with a cold beer. In the living room, he flipped through the local newspaper, presenting the image of a husband relaxing after a work trip. But beneath the surface, he was battling a personal crisis. He'd already worked his way through denial and anger, but bargaining, depression, and acceptance still loomed like unwelcome guests in his mind. The clock crept past midnight, and Mark busied himself cleaning the kitchen, fully aware it was just a way to delay what he had to face. When he finally ran out of distractions, he grabbed a light jacket and headed toward the side door. Halfway there, he remembered something, turned back, and sent an email from his laptop before stepping out of the house. After a few minutes in the garage, he started his car and drove off, the garage door humming closed behind him. At exactly 7:37 a.m., a call came through to Sharpsburg's emergency dispatch. "Emergency services, what's your emergency?" a comm operator asked. A nervous young woman's voice responded, "I need the police. I think something bad happened. Can you tell me your location, ma'am?" The operator continued. "I'm at a payphone on Park Drive near George Washington Park," the caller replied, her voice shaky over the poor connection. "What's the nature of the crime? Were you attacked or robbed?" The operator pressed. There was a brief silence before the woman answered hesitantly, "No, it wasn't me. I'm fine. But I was running through the park on the road leading to the picnic area, and I saw a car parked there. The doors were open, the lights were on, and there was blood. A lot of blood." The operator's tone turned serious. "Do we need an ambulance? Are there injuries?" "No," the woman said quickly. "There was no one there, just the car and the blood. I didn't stick around. I got scared someone might come after me, so I ran to call you." "You did the right thing," the operator assured her. "An officer is on the way and should be there within 10 minutes. Can you wait to guide them to the exact location?" The caller's panic rose. "No. What if someone comes after me? I'm going home." Without waiting for a response, she hung up. The operator stared at the now silent line, muttering under their breath, "Damn, I hope I didn't just pull officers off something more critical." By early afternoon, Detective Peter Nesbitt arrived at the Evans house. As he stepped out of his car, a blonde woman pulled into the driveway. He approached her swiftly. "Excuse me, ma'am. I'm looking for Mrs. Evans." The woman, pulling a suitcase from her car, glanced at him warily. "That's me, Lisa Evans. Who are you?" "I'm Detective Peter Nesbitt with the Sharpsburg Police Department. We're trying to locate your husband, Mark Evans. His car was found abandoned in George Washington Park earlier this morning," he said, flashing his badge. Lisa's expression shifted from confusion to concern. "Mark's in Pittsburgh," she said, frowning. "He always leaves his car at the airport. There must be a mistake." Nesbit shook his head. There's no mistake. Both the license plate and VIN match his registration. Lisa's confusion deepened. If that's true, then someone must have stolen his car from the airport. I don't know what else to tell you. When did you last hear from him? Nesbit asked. Could you try calling him now? Does he have a cell phone? Lisa paused, setting her suitcase down to dig through her purse. He called me yesterday morning from Pittsburgh. I'll call him now. She dialed his number, but to her shock, a phone started ringing in Nesbit's pocket. The detective answered, "Hello." Lisa's eyes widened. "How do you have Mark's phone?" "I can't share many details," Nesbit said grimly. "But it was found in his car, and it's evidence in a potential major crime." Lisa's concern turned into alarm. "Major crime? What are you talking about?" "There was blood found in your husband's car, along with a bullet hole," Nesbit explained. "We need to find him to determine if he's a victim or involved in some way. Could you call the hotel where he's staying?" Lisa grabbed her briefcase, her hands trembling slightly. "The number's in my address book. He always stays at the same Holiday Inn." She led the detective inside, where she quickly located the number and called. A moment later, she hung up and turned back to Nesbit, her face pale. Mark's briefcase and laptop were still sitting in the living room, untouched. Lisa shook her head in confusion. "I don't understand," she said softly. Detective Nesbit, deep in thought, pulled out his phone and called his colleague. "Hi, Dave. This is Pete. I need a search warrant for the Evans house. We need to figure out if Mark Evans is a victim or a suspect. Can you bring it over ASAP? I'll wait here." He ended the call and took a seat across from Lisa. Lisa's face was a mix of frustration and worry. "A search warrant? You don't need one. You can look wherever you want. Just ask. I want you to find my husband." Nesbit's tone was measured as he replied, "I have to follow protocol, Mrs. Evans. If your husband is involved in anything illegal, any evidence collected without a warrant could be thrown out in court." Her expression shifted from anger to indignation. "Illegal? Mark isn't doing anything illegal. He's a systems analyst. He works with computers." Nesbit leaned forward slightly. "Then why would he return to town without telling you?" Lisa's face turned pale, and her voice dropped to a whisper. "Oh no, he can't be." Her words trailed off, and panic began to creep into her voice. "I have no idea why he came home early, detective. All I know is that Mark isn't mixed up in anything illegal. He's probably hurt somewhere. You have to find him." Nesbit softened his tone. "We don't know anything for certain yet, Mrs. Evans. But I need to do this the right way. Every available officer is looking for your husband. In the meantime, why don't you make some coffee while we wait for the warrant?" The suggestion seemed to calm her slightly, and she moved to the kitchen to make coffee. But as she set up the coffee maker, her shoulders tensed again when Nesbit asked, "While we're having coffee, could you walk me through how you spent the last 48 hours? We need statements from everyone who might be involved." After a few minutes, they sat at the kitchen table, coffee cups in hand. Nesbit started with the basics. He described the state of Mark's car, the bullet hole, the blood, and what it implied. "The blood suggests a second bullet hit the body, which was found lying on a pile of firewood near the car," he explained. "We're still examining the evidence, and the car's been towed for a deeper inspection. The medical examiner and forensic team are working at the scene." Detective David Clean, Nesbit's partner, arrived with the search warrant, accompanied by 2 forensic technicians. The team began a meticulous search of the Evans home, garage, and vehicles. Nesbit coordinated with Lisa to collect Mark's razor and toothbrush for DNA testing. Seeing how distraught she was, he suggested she rest on the couch while the search continued. After about an hour, the team decided to take Mark's briefcase, laptop, and DNA samples. When they tried accessing the laptop, it was password protected. Nesbit asked Lisa, "Do you know your husband's password?" Lisa, eager to help, said, "It used to be his first and last name with his birth year, Trimark 1971. It should still work." Unfortunately, none of the variations worked. Nesbit reassured her, "Don't worry. Our technicians will find a way. The confiscated items were loaded into the forensic van. Nesbitt then sat down with Lisa to gather a statement. Mrs. Evans, I need some basic information about your whereabouts this weekend. Let's start with Saturday morning. Lisa took a deep breath. Saturday morning, I did some chores around the house. Mark called me from Pittsburgh around 1 o'clock or 1:30 to apologize for not being home. After that, I went shopping and got back around 4:30. I stayed in for dinner, then went to a friend's house around 7:30 and stayed the night. This morning, I woke up late, took my time, and didn't get home until about 2 o'clock. As she recounted her weekend, her hands tightened into fists, and her gaze fixed on the floor. Nesbitt finished jotting down notes, closed his notebook and said, "This will do for now, Mrs. Evans. We might need more details later, so please be ready." Before leaving, Nesbitt asked, "Do you have any recent full-length photos of your husband? A clear headshot would also help." Lisa pointed to the mantel where several framed photos stood. "We only have his driver's license photo, but there are some more recent ones in this album." She handed it to Nesbitt, who flipped through and selected a group photo and a clear headshot of Mark. "These are perfect," he said. Then, pointing to another man in one of the pictures, he asked, "Who's this? A relative? If we need another DNA sample, a family member could help." Lisa shook her head. "That's Blake Moore, Mark's best friend since childhood. Mark doesn't have any relatives nearby." Nesbitt thanked her and rejoined the team in the garage. As they searched, they discovered bloodstains on the gas and brake pedals of Lisa's car. This finding prompted them to tow her vehicle for further analysis. When the detectives informed Lisa, she was stunned. "Blood in my car? I haven't been to the park in weeks. How could there be blood in my car?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We're not making any assumptions," Nesbitt said. "But if the blood is connected to the park incident, we'll find out." Lisa handed over the shoes she had worn that day, then slumped into a kitchen chair, burying her face in her hands as sobs racked her frame. The detectives exchanged a glance and left her to process everything. As they drove back to the station, Nesbitt asked his partner, "What do you think of her? A worried wife? Or is she hiding something?" David Cleanside. "She seems sincere, but if the blood in her car belongs to Mark, we can't rule her out. Maybe she was talking to someone important on that call earlier." Nesbitt nodded. "Let's talk to their friends and neighbors. Someone might know why he came back early. That feels like the missing piece." Back at the station, they filed their reports and began piecing together the growing list of clues. By the next morning, both detectives were ready to dive back into the case. The forensic team was already waiting for them with the latest findings. The medical examiner's report took an hour to go through. Peter carefully reviewed every detail, noting how the findings all pointed in the same direction. Still, he cautioned himself. "We shouldn't jump to conclusions. Let's dig further. Maybe the computer will reveal more. In the meantime, we should talk to Mark's lawyer and his colleagues." David nodded in agreement. Their first stop was the office of Mark's lawyer, Robert Graham. Though clearly busy, Graham granted them a few minutes. "I can't discuss my client's legal matters," he said curtly. "What do you need?" Detective Nesbitt handed him a set of printed emails. "We need to confirm whether these emails, sent from Mark Evans' computer, were actually delivered or if they're just drafts." Graham studied the papers briefly before nodding. "These are originals. I can confirm receipt." The detectives thanked him and returned to their car, exchanging a glance of satisfaction. As they drove toward ABC Industries, Peter remarked, "You know the stats, Dave. 9 times out of 10, the spouse is involved. But we've still got work to do." At Mark's workplace, they were ushered into the office of his supervisor, who seemed eager to cooperate. "Mark's a valuable employee," the man said. "What do you need?" David led the questioning. "We're investigating the discovery of Mark Evans' car in George Washington Park. You might have seen the news. Can you confirm whether he was supposed to stay in Pittsburgh through the weekend?" He mentioned seminars on Saturday and Sunday. The supervisor frowned. "No, Mark didn't have any seminars scheduled. I expected him back by Friday night." David jotted this down. Have you noticed anything unusual about him lately? Was he acting differently? The supervisor leaned back, considering. Now that you mention it, he did seem preoccupied, like he had a lot on his mind. I asked if everything was okay, and he said it was. I figured he was just buried in work. The detectives thanked him and returned to their car, feeling like they were making progress. By late morning, back at the station, they received 2 key updates: preliminary DNA results and a forensic report. Among the evidence was a strange box with wires. Piecing the clues together in the interrogation room, Peter and David reviewed their notes, feeling a growing sense of clarity about the case. They decided to visit Lisa Evans again. This time, they didn't call ahead, hoping to catch her off guard. When they arrived at 3 p.m., Lisa appeared startled. "Detectives, have you found Mark? I've been calling the sergeant every couple of hours, and he hasn't told me anything new." Nesbitt shook his head. "Not yet, but we've made some progress. We need to ask you a few more questions." Lisa, looking uneasy, gestured them inside. "Sure. I'll do whatever I can to help." In the living room, they sat across from her. Detective Klein opened his notebook. "Is there anything you'd like to share about your relationship with Blake Moore?" Lisa froze, her face draining of color. "Blake? He's Mark's best friend. He's just a friend," she stammered. Detective Nesbitt's tone remained calm but firm. "Are you having an affair with Blake Moore?" Lisa's voice rose in shock. "Absolutely not. How can you even ask me that?" Standing, Nesbitt replied, "We need you to come to the station to give a formal statement." Panic flickered across Lisa's face. "Am I under arrest? Why do I need to go to the station?" "You're not under arrest," Klein assured her. "But we do need an official statement. You can bring a lawyer if you'd like." Lisa shook her head quickly. "No, I don't need a lawyer. I'll come to the station. I'll do whatever it takes to help find Mark." She escorted them to their car. At the station, they led her to a dimly lit interrogation room designed to make the subject uneasy. Nesbitt gave her one last chance to request a lawyer. "Are you sure you don't want one?" he asked gently. "No," she said firmly, her blue eyes brimming with tears. "I just want to help." Nesbitt stepped out of the room, ensuring the cameras were recording. Detective Klein spoke with their commanding officer. "Let's make sure we capture everything. I have a feeling we're close to cracking this case." Peter rejoined them with a stack of files but suggested, "Let's grab a coffee first. Give her some time to think." The 3 men spent the next 20 minutes in the station coffee shop, strategizing the interrogation and analyzing their progress. Meanwhile, across town, a volunteer at Crime Stoppers answered a call. "Good morning, Crime Stoppers. We pay up to $1,000 for tips on unsolved crimes. This call is being recorded," the volunteer said. There was a pause before an older man spoke. "If I help the police, do I get the money right away?" "That depends on the quality of your tip and how much it helps," the volunteer replied. "Do you have information about a crime?" After another pause, the man asked suspiciously, "What if the police trick me?" "The money doesn't come from the police," the volunteer reassured him. "So no tricks. Share your tip and I'll give you a code. You can check back in a few days to see if it helped." The man sounded frustrated. "I need money now. I need juice." Thinking he misheard, the volunteer clarified, "If you need food, I can direct you to shelters. Not food juice, the kind that costs $5 a bottle." Suppressing a smile, the volunteer said, "If your tip is good, you'll be able to buy plenty of juice." The man sighed. "Fine, I'll wait. I saw someone throw a weapon into the river under the 3rd Street Bridge on Sunday morning. He had a rifle and 2 shovels." The volunteer leaned in. "Was this on the east side of the bridge? Did he throw everything in the water?" "Yes, off the dock. I can describe him, big guy, blonde hair. He was driving a dark blue car. The license plate started with SS, but I can't remember the rest." The volunteer noted the details. "I've got everything we need. Your code is 127. Call back in a few days to check on the status." The volunteer relayed the tip to the police, and within an hour, divers retrieved the items. The rifle was immediately sent to the crime lab and matched ballistics from the George Washington Park shooting. 2 shovels were also recovered. As Nesbitt and Klein left the coffee shop, they were handed the Crime Stoppers report and ballistics results by a clerk. "Detectives, we've recovered the weapon used in the George Washington Park case. This report might lead you to the perpetrator." The detectives skimmed the reports and pulled up vehicle records. "Let's divide and conquer," Klein suggested. "I'll question Lisa again while you bring in Blake Moore." "Sounds like a plan," Nesbitt agreed. "This case is finally coming together." With the reports in hand, they went their separate ways, each determined to uncover the truth. In the interrogation room, Lisa Evans sat waiting, calm and composed. There was no visible trace of fear or sadness on her face. Meanwhile, Detective Nesbitt arranged for a uniformed officer to visit Blake Moore's house, ensuring all angles of the investigation were covered. Detective Klein entered the room and offered a polite apology. "Sorry to keep you waiting, Mrs. Evans. Just so you know, this room is monitored and recorded." Lisa gave a small shrug. "I don't mind. I have nothing to hide." "Good," Klein said, taking his seat. "Let's get straight to the point. Are you having an affair with Blake Moore? Yes or no?" Lisa's shoulders sagged, and she turned her face away, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes." Klein placed a set of papers in front of her. "We have proof of the affair. Your husband knew. He sent these emails to his attorney and was planning to file for divorce on the grounds of infidelity. This map shows your visits to Moore's house." Lisa stared at the papers, her face a mix of shock and disbelief. "How did Mark know?" Klein held up a small tracking device. "He installed this in your car. It let him monitor your location in real time." Lisa's eyes locked on the device, realization dawning on her. Mark knew for weeks, and he wanted a divorce? Tears welled up as the weight of it all hit her. She began to cry. Klein's tone remained steady as he pressed on. "Your husband didn't just document your visits to Blake's house. This map shows his last location from Saturday night, when he disappeared. Mark emailed his lawyer before heading out, saying he planned to confront you and feared he might be arrested afterward." Lisa looked up, her tears flowing freely. "But Mark never showed up at Blake's. I spent the night there." Klein didn't let up. "Preliminary DNA results show the blood found in the park matches your husband's. The weapon we recovered is linked to your lover, Blake Moore. The question now is, how long are you going to keep covering for him?" Lisa's voice quivered as she protested. "Blake didn't do anything to Mark. We were together all night." Klein leaned in. "We also found your husband's blood in your car and on your shoes. My partner is bringing Blake in now. Whoever tells us what happened first and helps us find Mark's body will get a better deal." Lisa sat frozen, visibly shaken. Klein handed her the blood test reports, but she barely glanced at them. "Mark can't be dead," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I love him. I need him." She sobbed uncontrollably, clutching a damp handkerchief. Klein gave her a moment to regain her composure. When she calmed slightly, he said, "There's no doubt your husband is dead. The medical examiner concluded that based on the amount of blood loss and the absence of treatment at any local medical facility, there's a 95% certainty he didn't survive." He slid a report and photos of the scene across the table. Lisa took one look at the bloody images and broke down again, sobbing uncontrollably. Klein stood and said, "I'll leave you alone for a few minutes to think. Denying responsibility won't help you." He placed the documents on his desk as he left, shaking his head as he passed his commanding officer. "I need a coffee," he muttered, heading to the break room. His commander stayed behind, keeping a close eye on Lisa through the interrogation room cameras. Meanwhile, Nesbitt had arrived at Blake Moore's house, meeting a patrol car already on the scene. To his surprise, Blake answered the door promptly. "Good afternoon. I'm Detective Nesbitt," he introduced himself. "We're here about Mark Evans' disappearance. We need you to come to the station for questioning. Mrs. Evans is already there, and we have some questions only you can answer." Blake frowned. "Am I under arrest? I know Mark's missing, but I don't see how I can help." You're not under arrest, Nesbit clarified. But we do need your input. Blake, too stunned to resist, complied and joined them in the unmarked car. As he sat in the back, Nesbit turned to him. How well do you know Mrs. Evans? She's just Mark's wife to me. Why do you ask? Blake replied, his tone defensive. Just curious, Nesbit said. What do you do for a living, Mr. Moore? I own Moore's Landscaping, Blake said, relaxing slightly. We handle a lot of commercial contracts, even work for the city. At the station, Blake was placed in an interrogation room adjacent to Lisa's. Nesbit collected the case files from Klein and began questioning him. At first, Blake denied the affair, but when presented with evidence from emails and surveillance reports, he admitted it. We've been involved for about 4 months, he confessed. But we didn't hurt Mark. We didn't even leave my house that night. Nesbit leaned back, skeptical. If Mark found out, do you think he might have gone into a rage or done something drastic? Blake offered a different angle. Maybe he hired someone to make it look like we were involved. Mark and I have history. He's not above pulling something crazy. Nesbit wasn't convinced. We have the weapon used. A witness identified you, your car, and even part of your license plate. Don't try to pin this on Mark. Blake's agitation grew. You don't know Mark. We've been best friends since we were kids. But I learned early on not to mess with his girlfriends. Once, in high school, I dated his girlfriend behind his back. When he found out, he scared me half to death, even though I'm bigger and stronger. He told me he'd liquidate me if I ever did it again. So you were afraid of him? Nesbit said, amused. But still had an affair with his wife? Blake sighed. I couldn't help myself. I've wanted her for years. A few months ago, I made my move. We've been careful. I don't know how he found out. Nesbit flipped through his notes. Affairs often lead to homicide. Either you and Lisa planned this or one of you snapped. Come clean, or you'll face the maximum penalty. Blake's voice rose. We didn't do anything. If Mark's hurt, maybe Lisa did something, but I don't know about it. Nesbit stood and gathered his papers. When accomplices work together, one always tries to pin it on the other. Don't think you'll be walking out of here anytime soon. Outside, Nesbit met Klein, who held another report. The shovels recovered from the river are from Moore's Landscaping, Klein said grimly. They must think we're fools. With mounting evidence, the detectives presented their findings to the district attorney. Even without a body, the case against Lisa Evans and Blake Moore was strong enough to press charges. Half an hour later, both were formally charged with Mark Evans' homicide. They protested their innocence as their Miranda rights were read. Afterward, they were fingerprinted and photographed, their protests falling on deaf ears. As they were led back to their cells, Lisa and Blake exchanged their first words since being charged. Lisa, still sniffling, asked, Blake, what are we going to do? They can't really think we had anything to do with Mark's disappearance. Can they? Blake sighed, frustration evident in his tone. We need lawyers, maybe even share one to save money since they've lumped us together. But this whole thing is wrong. I think Mark set us up. Lisa stopped in her tracks, her voice trembling with disbelief. You can't be serious. Why would Mark go to such extremes? Blake leaned against the cell bars, his voice low. I don't think you knew Mark as well as you thought you did. Honestly, I'm surprised he didn't do something drastic sooner. If I'd thought he might find out, I never would have touched you. As they stood separated by the cold concrete wall, Blake recounted a story from their younger years about secretly dating one of Mark's girlfriends. Mark scared me back then, he admitted. Even though I was bigger and stronger, he made it clear I'd regret crossing him again. Lisa listened, her mind racing. I can't believe he'd do this. We were always so careful, only meeting when he was out of town. I don't even know how he found out, she said thoughtfully, guilt creeping into her voice. After a pause, she added softly, I regret betraying him. Even if he's gone, I want a divorce. Her voice broke with emotion. Blake, hearing her sobs, spoke firmly. Lisa, stop. You knew the risks when you came to my house. You were aware of the consequences. She quieted down and replied, almost in a whisper, "You're right. I just hope he can forgive me." After a moment of silence, Lisa suggested, "We could call Robert Graham. He's our attorney. Maybe he can represent both of us and help split the costs." Blake agreed, and Lisa flagged down an officer to make the call. However, Robert Graham declined due to his involvement in Mark's divorce proceedings, recommending his colleague, Basil Smith, instead. Lisa relayed this to Blake, who was relieved. "That works," he said, thankful for any progress. They waited in their cells until Basil Smith, a seasoned attorney with a sharp reputation, arrived. After brief introductions, Smith sat down and reviewed the charges. "You're both accused of Mark Evans' homicide. Let's start with what the officers told you." "Mrs. Evans, you first, just the key points." Lisa recounted everything through tears, finishing with, "I didn't do anything. I love Mark. I could never hurt him." Smith turned to Blake. "Your turn." Blake summarized his experience, maintaining, "We had nothing to do with Mark's disappearance. I think he's behind this somehow to frame us." Smith, recognizing the urgency, cut to the chase. "Right now, we need to focus on securing your release. Bail will likely be set at $100,000 each. Can either of you manage that?" Lisa's eyes widened in shock. $100,000? How am I supposed to come up with that? Smith reassured her. "You'll only need 10% or $10,000 for the bail bond." Both nodded, agreeing they could handle it. Smith continued, "You'll be arraigned tomorrow morning. Bail will be set then, and you'll make arrangements to get out. For now, prepare to spend the night here." Hearing this, both Lisa and Blake reacted poorly, their frustration clear. Smith explained patiently, "Until the charges are officially filed, there's nothing more I can do. Once you're out, we'll start working on the case in earnest." That night, Lisa and Blake endured another miserable stay in jail, surviving on greasy takeout, a thin blanket, and the constant noise of rowdy cellmates. The next morning at 10 a.m., they met with their lawyer before court. Despite their disheveled appearance, they entered their pleas of not guilty. Bail was indeed set at $100,000 each. Blake, owning a home and a business, quickly secured a $10,000 bond and was released by early afternoon. Lisa, however, wasn't as fortunate. With no sole ownership of her home and finding her savings account empty, she reluctantly called her parents for help. After much persuasion, they agreed to provide the money, but the delay meant Lisa had to spend another night in jail. This time, she shared a cell with 2 intoxicated women. The next day, with the financial matters resolved, Lisa was finally released. She went straight home, showered, and ignored all incoming calls. Over the next month, Lisa learned that Mark had emptied their joint account before his disappearance, likely to secure his share before the divorce. Divorce papers arrived soon after, but she had no idea what he had done with the money. Meanwhile, Lisa and Blake met with Basil Smith several times. Smith received copies of the evidence and planned a meeting with the district attorney, arguing that without a body or a witness, obtaining a conviction would be nearly impossible. He also suggested hiring a private investigator to explore whether Mark had orchestrated his own disappearance. Blake readily agreed to the idea, but Lisa clung to her belief that Mark had been the victim of a botched carjacking. The investigators' efforts, however, yielded nothing. Attempts to identify the anonymous tipster who reported the discarded rifle and shovels were unsuccessful, as the caller never followed up. As weeks passed, tension between Lisa and Blake grew. After his release, Blake suggested continuing their affair, but Lisa refused, blaming him for their predicament. "I want nothing to do with you except for our court case," she said, often in tears. Blake's response was cold. "Suit yourself, Lisa. You're not the only woman in town." Their affair, once passionate, had turned icy. They only spoke in the presence of their lawyer, keeping their distance otherwise. A month after their release, Basil Smith arranged a meeting with the district attorney, Jeff Bagden. Lisa and Blake were hopeful that the charges might be dropped, as they had grown tired of constant interrogation about their relationship. Screening calls with caller ID and avoiding reporters had become their new normal. Jeff Bagden, surprisingly young and polished, opened the meeting with a blunt statement. Based on the evidence, I'm offering a reduced sentence of 8 to 12 years if you plead guilty to second-degree homicide. Lisa and Blake were stunned, loudly proclaiming their innocence. Smith, trying to defuse the situation, asked, "What evidence justifies this offer?" Bagden explained, "We've obtained new findings. DNA from the blood on your car's license plate and trunk gasket matches Mark Evans. Additionally, black polyethylene found under Mark's car matches material from Moore's landscaping business." Lisa turned on Blake angrily. "What have you done?" Blake shot back, his voice rising. "You know I didn't do anything. You were with me that night." Smith raised his hands to calm them. "Enough. This reaction isn't helping. Mr. Bagden, my clients were hoping for the charges to be dropped. This has obviously caught them off guard." Bagden smirked. "I understand, but we have enough evidence to proceed to trial. The medical examiner's report confirms Mark Evans lost too much blood to survive, and the crime scene indicates his body was dragged away." Lisa and Blake were loaded into a car, both visibly shaken. The prosecution was confident, and Jeff Bagden handed over the case reports before leaving the courtroom. Lisa and Blake turned to Basil Smith, whispering in a panicked tone, but Smith cut them off sharply. "Stop. I know you're shocked, but fighting each other won't help. We need to focus on a defense. Do you want to reject the plea deal?" Both vehemently refused the deal, adamant they wouldn't be convicted. Smith nodded, though inwardly he wondered if his clients were being entirely truthful. Despite his doubts, he was committed to their defense. Months later, the trial opened on a Monday morning. Judge Robert Cox took his seat at exactly 10 a.m., maintaining his usual stern demeanor. Basil Smith sat between Lisa and Blake, aware of the growing tension between the two. He had considered recommending separate lawyers, but financial constraints had made it impossible. Blake's business was on the verge of collapse, and Lisa had quit her job under the mounting stress of the trial and the social fallout with her missing husband's friends. District Attorney Jeff Bagden began his opening statement confidently. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we do not have Mark Evans' body, but we will prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he is dead, and that the defendants are responsible for his homicide." Bagden outlined the prosecution's case. He revealed that Mark had discovered Lisa's affair with Blake and had taken steps to file for divorce. While the exact moment he found out was unclear, traces on his computer showed that he had tracked their meetings, planned his financial separation, and intended to confront them. "We cannot say exactly when the confrontation occurred," Bagden continued, "but evidence points to the defendant's meeting at Mr. Moore's residence. There, Mr. Evans was incapacitated, placed into the passenger seat of his own car, and driven to George Washington Park. While likely unconscious, he was shot in the upper chest, dragged from the vehicle and shot a second time, this time severing his carotid artery. Graphic photos of bloodstains, bullet holes, and drag marks were displayed on a screen, prompting Lisa to lose her composure. She broke down, wailing, "No, Mark can't be dead." Judge Cox banged his gavel, ordering order to be restored. Once Lisa calmed down, Bagden pressed on. After the second shot, Mr. Evans' body was wrapped in plastic, placed in Mr. Moore's trunk, and driven to an unknown location where it was buried. The homicide weapon and shovels were discarded in a river, but thanks to a concerned citizen's tip, police recovered them. Forensic analysis confirms the defendant's presence at the scene. Mr. Evans' blood was found in Mr. Moore's car and on Lisa Evans' shoes. Concluding his statement, Bagden warned the jury. "The defense will argue alibis, claiming they weren't at the scene, but I trust you'll see through their story and deliver a verdict of guilty." Smith, rising for his opening statement, emphasized the presumption of innocence. "Ladies and gentlemen, remember that it is the prosecution's burden to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. You must focus on the evidence, not assumptions or emotions." The first witness was a computer expert who testified about emails and GPS data from the tracking device Mark had installed in Lisa's car. These showed precise times and locations of her visits to Blake's residence. Mark's meticulous documentation embarrassed Lisa, who avoided eye contact with the jury, while Blake appeared disinterested. Smith's cross-examination yielded little. The tracking device and emails were indisputable. After an extended lunch break, the trial resumed with testimony from the emergency operator and 2 patrol officers who responded to the scene. Their accounts were factual but lacked dramatic revelations. The intensity of the trial rose, however, when detectives and the medical examiner described the crime scene, supported by large, graphic photographs of bullet holes, blood spatter, and drag marks. The medical examiner's testimony detailed the blood loss, estimating it to be between 3 and 4 pints. He described blood jets consistent with a severed artery, concluding that Mark Evans was dying or already dead by the time he was moved. Lisa again lost control, screaming, "No, Mark can't be dead." The judge adjourned the trial until the next morning. The second day began with the medical examiner continuing his testimony, focusing on blood sample tests. After 15 minutes, District Attorney Bagden concluded his questioning and turned the witness over to Smith. The defense attorney, aware that Lisa was sedated, calmly began his cross-examination. "You estimated that Mark Evans lost 3 to 4 pints of blood," Smith said. "But isn't it possible the volume was closer to 1 or 2 pints, depending on how the blood was distributed?" The medical examiner hesitated before answering. "It's unlikely, but not impossible." Smith pressed further. "Could immediate first aid have reduced the severity of his injuries?" "It's unlikely," the examiner admitted, "but not impossible. It would have required immediate medical attention." Smith nodded, using these minor concessions to suggest uncertainty about Mark's death. He dismissed the witness and sat down, having achieved his goal of introducing some doubt. The next witness was a forensic scientist specializing in weapons and ammunition. He testified about 2 bullets recovered from the scene. One was deformed and found in the car seat, while the other, recovered from the firewood, was in near pristine condition. Both matched the recovered weapon. Smith asked, "Were the bullets examined for traces of bone or flesh?" The technician replied, "There were minimal traces of blood. Passing through layers of padding and fabric likely cleaned them." He added that the bullets were full metal jacket rounds, often used in military firearms. These bullets have a copper steel jacket, which is harder and more durable than standard all-metal jackets made purely of copper. Smith concluded his cross-examination, subtly implying that the lack of significant residue on the bullets raised questions about the circumstances of the shooting. The trial continued, presenting both opportunities and challenges for the defense. While the prosecution lacked direct evidence that the bullets had passed through Mark Evans' body, the circumstances and type of ammunition supported their case. Attempts to trace the weapon proved futile. It had been sold at a gun show over 20 years ago, with no buyer records. However, Basil Smith highlighted that no fingerprints or DNA from Lisa or Blake were found on the weapon or shell casings. Anything not washed away by the river had been wiped clean before disposal. A forensic technician testified about the shovels recovered from the river. Although no DNA or fingerprints were found, the shovels were branded with the logo of Moore's Landscaping. A search of Blake's business revealed 14 identical shovels. Cross-examination yielded no new insights, leaving the defense at a disadvantage. The prosecution's witnesses from the Forensic Science Department and police took the stand throughout the day. Smith's most significant cross-examination came when a technician testified about blood found in Blake Moore's car. Under questioning, the technician admitted that the blood could have been planted by a third party, giving Smith a small but meaningful victory. However, the situation grew more complicated with testimony about blood found in Lisa's car and on her right shoe. The technician conceded they couldn't determine whether the blood had been transferred from the shoe to the gas pedal or vice versa. Smith clung to this uncertainty, hoping it would cast doubt on Lisa's involvement. On the third morning, the defense began presenting evidence. Local newspapers speculated that Smith faced an uphill battle against the prosecution's strong case but noted that the absence of a body could make a conviction challenging. Smith's strategy relied on raising doubts about whether Mark Evans was truly dead. The defense's first witness was Dr. Wilbur, a blood analysis expert. He testified that the crime scene evidence had been poorly collected. Properly analyzing the blood-soaked soil, he explained, could have provided a more accurate estimate of blood loss. Dr. Wilbur suggested that as little as 1.5 to 2 pints of blood could have created the scene, leaving open the possibility that Mark was still alive. The district attorney declined to cross-examine, letting the testimony stand. Next, Blake Moore took the stand, maintaining his innocence and speculating that Mark had orchestrated his own disappearance. Blake denied owning a weapon and suggested the shovels could have been stolen from one of his worksites. Smith kept his testimony brief before turning him over for cross-examination. Jeff Bagden, however, quickly turned the tables. "Mr. Moore," he began, "why do you think Mark Evans would stage his own death?" Blake recounted the story of Mark threatening him in high school after Blake secretly dated Mark's girlfriend. Bagden pounced. "So this isn't the first time you've interfered with Mark Evans' relationships. Don't you think if Mark wanted to destroy someone, he would have chosen you?" Blake faltered, muttering something about how his physical size would have deterred a confrontation. Bagden didn't miss a beat. "So you think you intimidated Mark into harming himself? Is that why you felt comfortable pursuing his wife?" Before Blake could respond, Bagden pressed on. "Your actions show you're a narcissist who thinks he can take what he wants. Friends, loyalty, and wives be damned." Smith immediately objected, arguing that the prosecutor was testifying rather than asking questions. The judge agreed, instructing the jury to disregard Bagden's last statement. Nevertheless, Blake left the stand visibly shaken, and Smith knew the testimony had backfired. Hoping for better results, Lisa Evans took the stand next. More composed than Blake, she emphatically denied any involvement in harming her husband. She suggested that Mark might have been the victim of a carjacking. Smith chose not to ask additional questions, leaving her testimony brief. Bagden, however, saw an opportunity. "Mrs. Evans," he began, "where were you between midnight Saturday and 2 p.m. Sunday?" Lisa hesitated. "I was at Blake Moore's house," she admitted, "from 8 p.m. Saturday until about 1:30 p.m. Sunday." "That's not quite specific enough," Bagden pressed. "What were you doing between midnight and 1:30 a.m.? Lisa flushed, clearly embarrassed. "We were in Blake's bedroom," she said reluctantly. "We were being intimate." "For how long?" Bagden asked. Lisa stammered. "Probably until after 1 a.m. And then, we slept until about 5:45 a.m., she replied, her voice barely audible. "Was Mr. Moore still in bed when you woke up?" Bagden continued. "Yes," Lisa admitted. "We, got intimate again before falling back asleep around 6:30. Bagden's tone grew sharper. "So you woke him up for more?" "No," Lisa said, her face red. "He was already ready." "Please clarify," Bagden insisted. "How exactly did you wake him up?" Lisa sighed in defeat. "I just started things." Bagden let the silence hang for a moment before delivering his final blow. "Mrs. Evans, you've said you love your husband, yet you spent that night with his best friend while he allegedly took his own life. How can we believe you weren't involved in his death?" Lisa began to cry, unable to answer. Judge Cox intervened, ending the questioning and announcing a lunch recess. During lunch, Basil Smith tried to console his clients, though privately he felt pessimistic. Both Lisa and Blake had faltered on the witness stand, and their testimony had done more harm than good. After the break, Smith announced that the defense had no further witnesses. The prosecution and defense prepared their closing statements. Bagden hammered home the overwhelming evidence against Lisa and Blake, emphasizing the affair, the tracking data, and the blood evidence. Smith countered by stressing the circumstantial nature of the case, the lack of a body, and the absence of a clear motive. He urged the jury to consider the possibility that Mark Evans was still alive. By 4 p.m., the case went to the jury. They deliberated for 2 hours before adjourning for the night. The next morning, Lisa and Blake waited in Basil Smith's office for the jury's verdict. Sharing the conference room, they temporarily set aside their animosity, clinging to the hope of acquittal. By 3:30 p.m., the call came. The jury had reached a verdict. At the courthouse, Lisa's parents sat nervously in the gallery. The verdict was announced swiftly: guilty of second-degree homicide. Lisa burst into tears, while Blake pounded his fist on the table in frustration. As the bailiffs moved in, they were handcuffed and led away, their future sealed by the jury's decision. As Lisa and Blake were taken into custody, Lisa managed to speak briefly with her parents, tearfully proclaiming her innocence. The week between their conviction and sentencing dragged on painfully. Lisa's parents visited her daily, offering support, while Blake received only a single visit from a distant cousin. At sentencing, both Lisa and Blake were handed identical punishments: 15 years to life in prison. Basil Smith promised to review court records for a possible appeal. Within 3 days, they were transferred to state prisons. Lisa's facility had a relatively good reputation, but Blake's was notorious for violence and frequent riots. With the trial over, the media quickly lost interest, and the story of Lisa Evans and Blake Moore faded from public attention. A couple of months later, Basil Smith and Jeff Bagden met over drinks to reflect on the case. Smith sipped his whiskey thoughtfully. "I'm still surprised they were convicted. Their stories were consistent, and there were enough gaps in the evidence to suggest innocence." Bagden shrugged. "The jury didn't believe them. I've learned not to take cases like this personally unless they involve particularly heinous crimes or children. This one wasn't the worst, but it didn't inspire much sympathy for the defendants." A year later, a news report broke about a violent disturbance at Blake's prison. During the riot, Blake was stabbed and suffered a collapsed lung. He was rushed to the hospital in serious condition but was expected to survive. Meanwhile, 18 months after Lisa and Blake's conviction, Basil Smith rarely thought about the case. He had spent the first year meticulously reviewing court transcripts but found no viable grounds for appeal. Then, on a quiet Wednesday morning, the New York office of the Innocence Project received a mysterious FedEx package. Inside the package were a DVD, a sealed biohazard bag, and a multi-page letter. Intrigued, the receptionist called Tony Kelly, a young lawyer on the team. Tony, dressed casually in jeans and a polo shirt, took the package to his office. He had been with the Innocence Project for a year and was passionate about helping those wrongfully convicted. Sitting at his desk, he opened the letter first. The letter began, "To the Innocence Project. I'm writing regarding the convictions of Lisa Evans and Blake Moore. I don't know where to start, so I'll begin at the beginning. My name is not important, but the information I have could change the lives of the 2 convicted individuals and 5 others, including myself." The writer explained that 15 months earlier, a man had responded to an ad seeking a computer-literate individual. This man, referred to only as Mark, demonstrated exceptional skill with business networks and was hired immediately. Within 2 months, Mark's efforts had grown the business by 50%. The employer, who was also the letter's author, rented Mark a basement room in their home, as Mark had just arrived in town and hadn't secured housing. Over the next 3 months, Mark proved to be a diligent worker, often putting in extra hours without pay. His quiet nature and hard work won over his employer, who eventually invited him to join family meals. What began as a professional relationship evolved into a deep friendship and later a romantic one. The employer's young son even began calling Mark Dad. However, the writer sensed that Mark was harboring a dark secret. One afternoon, determined to help him, the employer locked the office door and confronted Mark. After some hesitation, he confessed. He was running from a failed marriage, deeply scarred by his wife's betrayal with his best friend. Mark admitted he had come dangerously close to committing homicide and then taking his own life. The letter continued, "Mark told me that about 2 years ago, he discovered his wife Lisa's affair with Blake Moore. It started with a small bruise on her chest, a mark she claimed was from bumping into furniture. But Mark knew it looked more like a love bite. His suspicions consumed him, and he couldn't shake the thought. A few days later, while evaluating a tracking device for his job, he decided to test it by installing it in Lisa's car. 3 days later, the tracker revealed the truth. Lisa, who had told him she was shopping, was actually at Blake's house. When he called her, she lied again, claiming she was still at the store. That night, Mark listened to her fabricated story while silently fuming. Over the next week, he tracked her movements, confirming her infidelity. On a business trip, he watched in real time as she spent the night at Blake's house, lying about being home the entire time. The betrayal crushed him. When he returned home, he contemplated destruction. He retrieved an old revolver from the widow next door, intending to confront Blake and Lisa and end their lives, as well as his own. But he hesitated. The following week, while waiting for them to meet again, he devised a new plan, one that wouldn't end in his own death. The letter described how Mark meticulously planned to frame Lisa and Blake for his own murder. He gathered supplies, claimed he had a weekend business trip, and waited for the perfect moment to set his plan in motion. Tony Kelly leaned back in his chair, stunned. He inserted the DVD into his laptop, eager to see what additional information it contained. The screen flickered to life, showing a pale, visibly older Mark Evans sitting in a dimly lit room. His voice, calm but strained, confirmed the details of the letter. He admitted to orchestrating his disappearance, planting evidence, and staging a crime scene to implicate Lisa and Blake. He expressed guilt over what he had done but justified his actions as the result of heartbreak and betrayal. Tony sat in silence as the recording ended. If Mark Evans was alive, it would mean Lisa Evans and Blake Moore had been convicted of a crime that never happened. Mark had carefully waited for the perfect moment to set his plan into motion. When he saw Lisa's car parked at Blake's house while he was supposedly away on a business trip, he seized the opportunity. He had already spent weeks crafting a paper trail to suggest he was divorcing her and implicating both her and Blake. Before leaving, he made sure to send a crucial email to his lawyer, a key piece of evidence to tie everything together. In the privacy of his garage, Mark fired a bullet into the passenger seat of his car and another into a wooden block, muffling the shots with a blanket. The act felt cathartic, marking the start of his revenge. "Check archived newspaper articles," Mark had said in his confession, hinting that court reporters had thoroughly documented the trial. He believed that a review of the complete transcript would clarify his orchestrations. Mark drove his car to a park near Blake's house late that night. Finding a secluded spot, he unloaded a gym bag filled with materials for his elaborate scheme. On a picnic table, he spread out firewood, plastic sheeting, and a spare tire, covering everything with an old blanket to avoid suspicion. He then created a drag trail leading from the picnic area to the paved road, scattering firewood to mimic signs of a struggle. Using a needle, Mark drew nearly 2 pints of blood from his own hand, diluting it with distilled water to simulate arterial spray. He sprayed the blood in patterns around the car and smeared it on the car seat, firewood, and ground. Exhausted and lightheaded, he paused to rest before cleaning up the area and returning everything to his gym bag. The work was meticulous, methodical even, but it left him dizzy from blood loss. Before leaving, Mark took a detour to Blake's house. Spotting Lisa's unlocked car, he applied a few drops of his blood to the gas pedal. He smeared more blood on Blake's car but panicked when he saw a light flick on in Blake's bedroom. Fleeing the scene, Mark stopped at a payphone, using a voice changer to report his car in the park, pretending to be a concerned woman. He later discarded the revolver and 2 shovels into the river before collapsing in a motel room, where he spent 2 days recovering. Mark's partner wrote in her letter to the Innocence Project that Mark had confessed everything to her, wishing to leave his past behind. He was determined to help exonerate Lisa and Blake, sending fingerprints and DNA evidence, along with a letter explaining his actions. The package included a DVD labeled photos taken in George Washington Park and a black plastic envelope containing fingerprints and DNA samples. The enclosed materials proved without a doubt that Mark Evans was alive. Tony Kelly, the young lawyer from the Innocence Project, immediately involved senior attorneys. The evidence was compelling. Mark's fingerprints matched those found in the park, and the DNA was a conclusive match to the blood at the scene. With this new information, the state attorney general and governor expedited the release of Lisa Evans and Blake Moore. A week later, Lisa and Blake returned to the courtroom with Basil Smith, Lisa's parents, and even District Attorney Jeff Bagden. State representatives and reporters filled the gallery. The state attorney general delivered a public apology, blaming Mark Evans for deceiving the justice system and announcing efforts to locate him. When asked where the search for Mark would begin, the Attorney General could only shake his head. "He's gone, and he planned this well." Blake Moore seemed a shadow of his former self, humbled, less arrogant. He apologized to Lisa for his role in the events that led to their imprisonment. Lisa, however, appeared indifferent, her focus solely on leaving with her parents. Both Basil Smith and Jeff Bagden offered their apologies, acknowledging they had been misled by Mark's manipulations. While the state found no liability for the wrongful conviction, both Lisa and Blake received $50,000 in compensation. For Blake, whose business had collapsed and whose home had been sold to pay legal fees, the amount felt insultingly small. "Mark ruined us," he told Lisa before leaving town. "This check is a joke compared to everything I lost." Lisa, weary and emotionally drained, replied, "We deserved it," before parting ways with him, not even offering a goodbye. 2 weeks after a cable news segment reported on Lisa and Blake's release, a large envelope arrived at Basil Smith's office. Inside was a note for the attorney and a sealed envelope marked for Lisa. Smith delivered the letter personally to Lisa's apartment, exchanging only brief pleasantries before leaving her with it. Lisa opened the envelope cautiously, her heart sinking as she recognized Mark's handwriting. She unfolded the letter and began to read. "Lisa, I am sorry for the time you spent in jail, but your betrayal with Blake pushed me to the brink of madness. I thought I had no other options, and I acted out of heartbreak and desperation. But my new life has taught me something important. Freeing you both was not only necessary but healing for me as well. I know the authorities will search for me, but I am confident they won't find me. I have a new life now with a new family and a fresh start. Please know that I truly wish you the best in moving forward. Goodbye, Mark." The letter slipped from Lisa's trembling hands. She stared blankly at the floor, her hope of any reconciliation with Mark shattered. The realization hit her hard. Mark had moved on, leaving her to rebuild her life from the ruins of his carefully executed revenge.